realizing that I haven't done it yet, and I'm willing to do it. But then TJ, I'll ask you to pay attention to the agenda so that I can take notes. That's okay with you?
Yeah, that works.
I can at least take on the very first topic being the approval of last time's minutes. And I've reviewed the minutes. I think Dave Farnsworth prepared them in serious detail. So thanks, Dave. And the only correction that I would offer is to spell my name correctly in the final line. So with that correction, I think the minutes are fine. Any other comments from anybody else? With that said, I take it we can declare the minutes approved. All right, TJ, over to you, and I'll take notes.
Great. So thanks, Rich, and thanks everybody for joining as we're getting into summer here. We have a couple items teed up for today's agenda. The first is circling back to the update to the business as usual forecast in the thermal sector. We have Dave Hill here and Taylor Binnington from EFG and SEI, respectively, their jumble of letters. In order to help us provide that update, they've been working pretty hard on incorporating feedback. There was a meeting, or perhaps two, with the buildings task group maybe 6 weeks ago, where input into kind of what items needed to be updated or should be updated and how was provided. And then as the timing worked out, this full committee meeting kind of worked out to present the results as opposed to having the task group and the cross sector both see it. So the timing worked out to do it today. So we'll spend the bulk of today's meeting on that, a little over an hour, and kind of presentation, Q&A, and then public comment specifically on the business as usual update. And then go into an update from Joey on the work of the transportation work group since the last time we met, where we kind of honed in on the transportation sector being a potential need for the cross-sector mitigation committee and the task group to continue to make progress on and discuss. So that is the agenda. And if did folks have anything they would like to add or comment on the agenda? Hearing none, I will turn it over already ahead of schedule when I facilitate the meetings, Rich. So we'll see if we can stay on track. We'll turn it over to David and Taylor, who I think have been here enough that you all have met them before.
Yeah, thank you, TJ. Hi, everybody. It is nice to be able to present to you again. Taylor and I, as TJ said, will be doing a presentation today. Some others on our team, Liz Bourget is out for her brother's wedding this coming weekend, so she's taking a day off and isn't with us today. And others that have contributed aren't joining, but Taylor and I can talk through the revised baseline, the updates to the model, and then with some focus on the results. And we are doing it in a way that addresses the specifics. There are some slides that have a lot of specifics about the individual changes, and we can go back to those, and if there are specific questions, we can touch on those. But we wanted to focus primarily on the results and what it means for the baseline in terms of anticipation of where things are. So we've got presentation that will run probably for a little more than a half hour, I would guess it, but we're happy to take questions kind of along the way, I think, as we go, if they're clarifying questions, but also just to give folks a sense. And as TJ said, the agenda has an hour plus allocated for this. So I will share my screen and see. Is that sharing the presentation mode or just is it sharing correctly? I'm always,
It's that's sharing the presentation mode. We can see
Okay.
next slide also.
yeah, I'm gonna try to, I don't know why that does that. Sorry, I know this has happened to me before. And it's gonna do that. So display settings, and I want to. How's
There we
that?
go. Well, looks good.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I think, as you all know, we SEI, EFG have this work together in terms of the climate action plan, the initial analysis for the Climate Council. And then we have been working with A&R and PSD and the Thermal Task Group on the analysis of building thermal sector emissions reductions policies for Vermont. And where we are and what we're going to focus on today or presentation to you all on the updates and the results to the LEAP model in the baseline scenario. And these are now in the version 3.08 of the model. We will look at and touch on, a few of the selected input assumptions, and if necessary, we can tailor, can share some of the screens, with the LEAP modeling if we want to look in a little bit more detail. But we're going to focus primarily on the building sector, and then also there are some transportation sector updates that as in the scope reflected the changes that we were meant to take into consideration. And we'll look at the results in terms of energy consumption and emissions. So the objectives from the scope of work and the RFP and our task group is to look at baseline updates from the modeling that was done for the CAP analysis to incorporate information on latest levels of adoption from the EEUs and other sources, what's been happening in Vermont's market, consider the impacts of new policies and programs, the federal incentives, and then other activities from the state, Act 185, and advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks, any major changes in economic or demographic drivers, and then fuel prices, some calibration to the latest results from state energy data system, and some changes just to help streamline the structure of the model kind of as we go along, continual improvements to the structure of the modeling. So I have a couple slides here that we're not going to go through these in depth, but we can come back to these. This is meant to show, this is kind of the change log for the residential sector, the changes that are incorporated. And so the first, these deal with wood stoves, pellet stoves, single-headed mini splits, double-headed units, update heat pump shares based on rebates and IRA expectations, adjusted share of heating load that's met by individual heat pumps, increased share of household heating needs that are met by centrally ducted systems, the projection of households, some change in there, heat pump water heaters baseline, household heating needs met by advanced pellet boilers, air to water heat pumps, wood and pellet stove penetrations, pellet boilers into the baseline, the allocation and displacement of what wood and pellet stoves are displacing. So heat pumps are not affect wood and pellet stoves in rural single family homes. Updates to the retrofits from 2020 and 2021. Historical space heating to reflect all different household types, some adjustments in the shares for heating shares that were in there, and water heating technology shares, and then, as I said, calibrating. So these are the, these are the summary of the changes. And again, we can come back to individual items as we'll be showing some slides related to most of these, and we can come back to individual items if there are more specific questions later on. In the transportation sector, relatively fewer but important changes nonetheless. So some service incorporating costs for service upgrades with a 200 amp service panel upgrade cost, and accounting for the upgrade costs being allocated. We don't want to be double counting for heat pumps and or passenger cars, but we do have panel upgrade costs and accounting for those for 200 amp services for 70% of the newly sold passenger cars or light vehicles. The advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks categories are both incorporated. We removed some fuel cell vehicles and the plug-in hybrid medium duty vehicles from the forecast. And there were some updates on the VMTs and calibration again of some of the transportation energy use. There are a few other changes that have been discussed that aren't completely into the baseline yet, and we'll probably be incorporating those in terms of the share of plug-in hybrid vehicles and the vehicle miles traveled. Cross-cutting, the fuel costs updates based on AEO 23 and some biofuel blending targets. Commercial floor space, there were some floor space adjustments, and we'll show some more detailed results on this, but there were some adjustments that would have increased floor space significantly. And so those were, we adjusted back to the initial cap analysis forecast for commercial floor space after some review and discussion with ANR and PSD. The efficiencies for the heat pumps, numbers of heat pumps, technology shares, calibration again, industrial calibration again. So that's an overview, and granted high level, and we'll present what this means graphically by individual elements, and then in aggregate what it means. I think one of the kind of the most important takeaways is to think about, well, where does the revised baseline put us in terms of these are emissions from the thermal sector, now residential, commercial, industrial, where they are in relationship to the GWSA targets or requirements. So by 2030, this is a gap of in the order of 300 metric tons, 1,000 metric tons. So the baseline adjustment narrows the old baseline. There's a slide later that shows the old baseline. The old baseline was higher, but it narrows the gap kind of that will be required by the policies and the scenarios that are analyzed. But the baseline still obviously it meets the 2025 requirements, but the 2030 requirements and 2050 requirements, still there's quite a lot left in terms of emissions reductions. So that's an overview of where we are. And as we've been working on this, the contributions from and the work from Taylor at SEI in terms of maintaining and updating the model, almost that work has been conducted primarily by Taylor, and he's done a very good job of keeping it organized and systematic, and helping us track the changes, and then recognizing the changes in one branch of the model, or that there are elements that are interrelated in the model, and as the modeling changes, the results of all these changes have interactive effects in many different cases. So what I'll do is we can pause there for a second if there are immediate questions. I'm not tracking. If somebody wants to track in the chat, we can take any immediate questions or comments. But if there are, and then what I'd like to do then is turn it over to Taylor, and he can go through again some of the more where we're headed is then more depth in the things that we've just gone over in terms of what they incorporate and what the results are for those. So,
David, I think there's a question from Liz.
okay.
Hey, David, just so I both get it and can explain it to colleagues,
Sure.
how does the changed assumption in the transportation table that you showed regarding 200 amp panel upgrades, how does that affect the emissions? Is it because of greater assumptions on load control through the chargers, or like what's the actual crosswalk from panel upgrade to 200 amp to then an emissions reduction in the model?
That's a good question. What would be reflected, Liz, is the cost for panel upgrades. So to allow for the vehicle electrification, we're assuming that there's a certain number of panel upgrades and that those would be costs that are associated in the
Yep.
model.
Okay, so I'm probably asking the question poorly, or it doesn't affect the emissions baseline itself. Does the panel upgrade actually show a reduction in emissions, or is it just an increase on the cost side for achieving emissions that are otherwise expected if people happened to
in the base
trickle charge, as it were, or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the baseline and in the other scenarios, there's now a cost associated with a certain share of
Got it.
the electric vehicles. And so that would be an additional cost in the baseline, as well as in the scenarios that are reaching the GWSA requirements.
Okay, that's super helpful. So it's a shift on the cost side, not directly, it doesn't have an effect therefore on the emissions reduction side. It's just a recognized reality that folks are going to need to upgrade as they
there may be some, yes.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear.
It looks like Rich and then Jared.
Yeah, thanks for this. Just a data question about 2030 based on what you're showing here in the thermal sector. You show a 25% reduction in 2025 and obviously continued further reductions to 2030. What percentage of the required reductions are you showing is delivered by the baseline conditions in 2030?
I'm not sure if I understand. So this is the baseline compared to the requirement. So the baseline is the assumptions in the baseline, and we'll go through those in more depth here. But the revised baseline has incorporated, as we said, updated activity levels, increased levels of weatherization, increased levels of heat pump adoption. So the baseline, we have a slide later again that has the old baseline. Perhaps we should have had the old baseline on this target as well. So there's a reduction. The old baseline, I don't have the number, I'm sorry, right off the top of my head, but the old baseline numbers are higher. And so I think what you're asking is how large is that gap between the revisions and the old baseline? Are you asking that?
No, I was just asking how much,
sorry,
considering a 40% sector reduction goal, how much are you projecting would be delivered by baseline conditions?
Oh, okay.
For 2025, you name it, you say 25% reduction. For 2030, you don't name it.
This is the requirement, and this level here is at about 18.
Okay, we can move on. You can
Could I-
figure this out later, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I could try to take a quick stab at this, because I think maybe knowing or get it might be helpful for sort of interpreting the other
Sure.
some of the other results. Also, hi everyone, good afternoon. So there we have only there is only one baseline, I guess. So what my interpretation, I guess, to what you're asking, Rich, is when we look at this sort of chart here, what fraction of relative to some other reference point does it get us towards the 3 dots, or the dot in 2030 at least? But we don't really have, this is the only reference point. So in terms of like how far it gets us relative to 2005 or 2019 emissions or something, I guess we could calculate that, but we haven't done that. But we can't really say how much of that emissions, or we can't really define an emissions gap between the 2030 requirement and any other emissions in that year, other than the emissions in this baseline that's shown here. But I'm not sure if that's an alternative sort of way of explaining it.
I'm happy for this to move on. I don't want to fudge up the conversation.
Okay. Jared?
Thanks, TJ, and thank you, David and Taylor. So I wanted to kind of give a apology and forewarning that what I'm going to say could get a little bit like weedy. So I'm going to try to take it slowly, but I think that there's an assumption baked in here that we need to step back and unpack a little bit. So the Global Warming Solutions Act requires that statewide we achieve a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030.
Yeah.
However, many folks will remember that as we developed the Climate Action Plan, we realized that there was another part of the Global Warming Solutions Act, specifically 592 D2, which called for having greenhouse gas emissions reductions that reflect the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. So we've kind of thought of that as, what is the share of sectoral responsibility in meeting those overall obligations? And when we looked at that, we said the sectoral share in 1990, how much emissions were coming from electricity versus RCI versus transportation, is different than the sectoral share that existed when the law was passed, and that is more reflective of the current environment. And so we said for that sectoral share of responsibility, the reference point would be the 2018 emissions, not the 1990 emissions for the sectoral share. And it looks to me, correct?
This is based on the 19.
That's right.
You're correct. So this is based off the share that the sectoral, the proportional share, but from the 2005 or the 1990 baseline. And so I think you're correct. We could revise these to show that, to calculate it off 2018, if that's your point, is that would be more appropriate.
I think that, so if I might, I think that that's really helpful in how we present this, Jared. I think what might be really useful for this committee is to kind of dive into some of what's caused, like the actual functional assumptions.
No, agreed.
Here.
I just wanted to flag it because I saw it.
Yeah, thank you.
And also to note that we actually did some analysis at EAN showing, the total reduction in 2025, 2030, and 2050 stays the same, of course, but depending on how you interpret that language, the sectoral share changes, and we have a few different scenarios that may be helpful. So I will share that with you, David and Taylor, in case that's helpful, and if others are interested, can share that. But I did want to flag that I think that we want to be using the 2018 sectoral shares of responsibility.
Yeah, thank you for that. Please do send it along, and if you could copy the state team also, really just, you can copy myself and Brian, and
great,
that'd be great. Okay, Thank you. I do appreciate that comment. It's useful to understand the presentation of it, but here getting into the details of some of these assumptions, which are causing a bigger reduction in the baseline than previously, I think it's important you all understand
Yeah.
that. So go ahead, David.
So, okay. So I will then, we can move along. Taylor, if you want to start commenting on or presenting on these.
Sure. That's great. Thanks very much, David.
Yep.
Thanks for sort of kicking us off here. And again, good morning or afternoon, folks. So as David kind of described, this, you know, I think the goal of our presentation here today is to highlight the highlights, I guess, by giving a little bit of a sort of a scattershot overview of what the most significant changes to the model have been. You know, those that we've had sort of the most discussion on, or which have had the largest, or which just as a measure have a relatively large impact on emissions, or which are relatively the most different compared to the previous baseline effort that we did. So we have you know, a couple of slides that go into some of the detail of the assumptions, and then we're trying to sort of represent some of those, either some of the inputs or the assumptions, or in some cases the outputs, represent those graphically, just so that we can get a little bit of more of a feel for what you know, what the biggest things are, I think, in this model. It's not, so I say that because this presentation is not, it's not, you know, a comprehensive blow by blow description of all of the individual changes we've made, and David sort of included that in a in tabular form just at the beginning of this in the slide deck, kind of just so that we have that a little bit on the record and so that we can refer to it if needed. So we'll kind of proceed, I guess, topic by topic, a little bit technology by technology or sector by sector, starting with heat pumps, starting in the residential sector. So we've made some fairly significant changes to the forecast for projected numbers and shares of heating load that would be met by heat pumps in the baseline scenario. So these assumptions were largely developed or kind of co-developed, I guess, between us and EFG. You know, SEI's role within the work was to implement the changes into the model. But those changes reflect you know, some trends that we've seen over the last couple of years change since the last baseline, as well as, of course, anticipated effects of IRA funding. We've also made some adjustments to the overall amount of, in this case, a household's heating load, which would be met by different types of heat pumps, differentiating between the heating load that is provided by like a single head versus a multi-head or central and ducted heat pumps as well. So we've made a couple of changes for those. But the next two slides just show this a little bit more graphically. So go ahead to the next. Thanks, David. So this chart gives the overall result for the share of residential heating load. So the amount of the useful heat that households require. That's met by heat pumps of any type, whether it's single or double or ducted, heat pumps of any type in different types of households that are resolved in the model. The yellow curve shows kind of the existing stock of buildings. The green curve shows the percentage for new builds, and then the blue curve is we have a different assumption we've made for multifamily. So multifamily being apartments of sort of five or more units. So this is the sort of overall percentage of the heating load that we're simulating. And then the next slide translates that into the individual heat pump technologies and expresses it as a number of heat pumps that would have to be deployed. So it's you know, there's a lot of different colors on this chart. You sort of have to look a little bit more carefully to unpack the differences between you know, the single-family, single-headed heat pumps versus multi-family, double-headed, et cetera, But you can see that the overall numbers, when you add all of these things up, you know, exceed or reach, and then they exceed about 400,000, not 500,000, but somewhere in between those two. And again, that's just recognizing that a lot of these types of heat pumps, and the single-headed ones in particular, they only meet about a quarter of the heating load of a household, of an average household. So that's why we can have, you know, more heat pumps deployed than even there would be households. Maybe after, or as we sort of go through each topic, I'll kind of pause for questions. This is the sort of what we have to say right now on residential heat pump deployments. Then we can take any questions and move to the next topic, or you can reserve questions until the end.
I just want to stop for a second, Taylor, on this one, just to highlight for the committee kind of this change. So there's a couple of changes here. One is that, as I think David said before, and maybe you said, the share of heating load met by each heat pump was actually reduced somewhat from previous, but then
Yes.
the numbers of heat pumps have increased significantly from the previous baseline. And that is based on Efficiency Vermont, like as it says here, Efficiency Vermont, Burlington Electric did their forecast, and we essentially took their forecast of what they expected to happen in the market due to their current kind of business as usual programs. And they had, before the IRA, about 175,000 heat pumps by 2030. If you all remember, this is burned into my brain because of this process, but the Pathways report had about 195,000 was the target for 2030. And so this is a really significant difference. And I wanted to emphasize that in case anybody had questions about it. On top of the DRP, the Efficiency Vermont and BED forecasts, then the IRA funding was taken into account because their forecasts were pre-IRA funding. And that's what that 6% increase is. So why you're getting like 200,000 by 2030.
Yeah, and the 6%, thank you, TJ, and the 6% increases in sales. So it's not just this is stock. So the impact on this is from a manufacturer, major manufacturer, estimating they anticipated a 6% increase in sales activity due to the combined impact of the IRA tax credits as well as incentives. And we have estimates of that being broken out, but those combined do result in, you know, this is over 200,000 units. Again, part of that is that they're serving a smaller, each unit is serving a smaller share of household heating, but there's a significant growth in the numbers for sure that are incorporated in the baseline. And roughly half of the growth that Taylor was mentioning by the end, roughly half of it is anticipated. It's over 200,000 units by 2030.
So it's a lot of heat pumps. Bram, you have a question?
Just to add a data point consistent with the increase in number of heat pumps, our single family home with centrally ducted heat is now 100% heated and cooled with heat pumps, but single family home, central ductwork, 3 heat pumps, and we could well add a 4th at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Taylor, what is the assumption, if you know, or David, off the top of your head, for the number of heat pumps per home? Because it's more than one, I think, right?
Yeah, so we make a related assumption that kind of answers that question. I guess you could have up to 4 if there were single-headed heat pumps. We've assumed that a single-headed heat pump provides a quarter, 25% of a household's heating load. A double-headed one is 45%, so a little less than double of a single. But the ducted heat pumps, the centrally ducted heat pumps, provides all of the heat. And so all 3 of those assumptions we have in the model have all been revised. Actually, the single and double-headed ones have been revised slightly downwards to account for the fact that they just tend to occupy a smaller share. But then the centrally ducted heat pumps, I think we used to assume that they met only 90% of heating load. Now it's 100%.
Right. Thanks. And then I think that's helpful. What I was getting at, I think, and maybe it's more of an output of the model for how all the inputs work, is that effectively there is like I can't remember the number, if it's 1.4 or 1.7, but it's over 1 heat pump per home is the result of this, is like as they're going in. That's not like 200,000 homes are getting that many heat pumps in 2030. It's something, a smaller number of homes or households that are getting that.
Yeah.
Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, TJ. One question I have is, in this model, are you assuming that the projected increases based in part on those assumptions you shared earlier, like a 6% per year sales increase, are kind of applied evenly across the different types of heat pumps, or do you see certain types of heat pump technologies differentially scaling up? And specifically, one of the reasons I'm asking this is because I believe I've heard from presentations in the past by EFG that I think the estimate is something like 30% of Vermont homes are primarily heated with forced hot air, and most of the remainder is primarily hydronic systems. And my assumption would be that for a lot of those forced hot air systems, that the central heat pump systems would be really
Best option, yeah.
attractive, and that even though we don't see a lot of adoption of those right now, as that technology matures, that may take up a larger share of total heat pump sales than it is now because of how attractive that option will be. So that's just a specific example of why I'm asking. But the question is, are you applying that increasing sales rate evenly across all of these types, or are you projecting that certain types will see greater ramps of adoption and some, less?
Yeah, good question. We haven't. I don't have, like, at my fingertips sort of a year-on-year ramping up for individual technologies, heat pump technologies. But what I do have is sort of a set of rules for how heat pumps displace other technologies inside different types of households. So in the case of centrally ducted heat pumps, we assume that what happens there is they can be introduced into a type of household that we have represented in the model. There's many types of households, sort of up to, and they displace as well, the fossil furnaces. So oil, so central air furnaces, oil and propane and gas, but only up until that ceiling. And then the remaining share of that household type's heating load is then divided, we made an assumption, equally between single-headed and double-headed heat pumps. So I think the sort of number that you're asking would end up being, an endogenously determined kind of output of the model, but I don't have it at my disposal. Yeah.
And on the sales, the impact, the estimate from kind of discussions with manufacturers, I do not think that I don't think that there was indication that I think that they were, I don't think the response that we got from them allowed us to differentiate that 6% on sales increase into the different various subcategories.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Did someone else have a question, or should we? I feel like we should move.
Yeah,
on to
we
the
should
next.
probably.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So on the next sort of major change to building heating assumptions that we made was to change the number of wood and pellet stoves or advanced pellet boilers that were found in the baseline. For example, we have introduced now a really small number of advanced pellet boilers in some types of households, and that was a technology that was exclusively reserved for a mitigation option in the last analysis. We've also, in some types of households, in rural single-family homes, we've gradually increased the share of heating that is met by wood or pellet stoves, whereas previously it was that wasn't a constraint, I guess, that we had included in the model. But the piece here after that semicolon in the second bullet is actually one of the more is sort of the most significant, I guess, assumptions that we have changed in this version of the model, which is that previously we assumed as we introduced heat pumps to meet a particular penetration level of heat pumps, they were sort of allowed to displace other technologies, fossil technologies, as well as wood burning technologies, wood and pellet stoves, in order to make room for all of those heat pumps. We have changed that, and now heat pumps don't displace wood and pellet stoves, and that means that but some technology has to withdraw in order to create room for those heat pumps. And so that actually sort of shifts that more onto the fossil technologies. So there's a steeper incline in gas and oil and propane heat because of that assumption there when we create room to for all of the additional heat pumps.
Yeah.
And the way that sort of shakes out, graphically is on the next slide. This kind of combines the assumptions that we were talking about with heat pumps, but also with wood and pellet stoves. So this is one household type that we have represented: rural single-family detached homes, and you can see as all of the numbers are normalized to 100%. So this is the percentage of the useful heat, or the percentage of the heat needs that are met by different technologies. And you can see the light blue and the variants of the light blue represent the heat pump technologies, but then the green on the top, where did it go? It represent wood and pellet stoves. Where is the wood stove in the legend? I've just lost it. Makes me wonder if somehow when we created this chart, I failed to click and drag the size of the legend enough to have all of the elements appear. I think there are wood stoves in there. I apologize for that. That should be the sort of dark green color at the top.
I think it's the top one. Yeah, it is the top one. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see that either. But so and Jared, a little bit to your question, this is showing, but that the impact, say, on the IRA versus, is it producing from that 6% increase is again an increase in sales. This is the shares of the different heat pump technologies that are anticipated, but that it's not based on any disaggregation of differentiation, I should say, of different impacts by the types. I think that there is some of that in the data that we had from the EEUs, if I'm not mistaken. But so this is the single head and the centrally ducted and the two head. I think that these two are a little hard to distinguish. I think the two head and the single head are both in that slice.
David, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Taylor, I just need a clarification here. I think in the prior slide, you drew our attention to you said the language after the semicolon there. Heat pumps do not displace wood or pellet stoves. I think you were trying to say they don't replace them, but they can displace them. And that distinction, the way I think of it, is that if I have a wood stove and a heat pump, it might be easier just to use the heat pump a little bit more and displace the use of the wood stove, and not. But I think you were saying actually you meant replace. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's a really interesting question. I guess I suppose my use of the word displace here is, so perhaps I'll try to answer this in hopefully not too roundabout a way, but the model doesn't necessarily resolve individual households that might have sort of competing different heating technologies, like a wood stove and a heat pump, and it's not sort of simulating how within a single household you know, a user might use a heat pump instead of a wood stove, for example. It's really for the stock, the entire sort of stock of a set of households. And so what I meant to convey here was that when we you know, throughout an entire stock of buildings has a set of heating needs met by a set of different technologies, sort of on average, different percentages in each year. And when we introduce new heat pumps that then occupy some of that heating share, we have to reduce the amount of heating share that other technologies provide. And what we have done is to assume that they don't displace heat that would have been provided by wood or pellet stoves.
And
So I think what that means is that I do mean that heat pumps do not displace them, but the individual decisions that I guess are made sort of within a household about sort of when the that sometimes a heat pump might run to provide heat that is not being provided by a wood stove. I think those would be captured kind of in the overall like average shares of heating load that are being provided for the whole stock of buildings.
within this, within this, maybe one way of saying it, within this, there will be households that have supplemental heat with two head and single head that would also have wood stoves. So, and it's not, that's incorporated by the share. This is share of useful heat overall, as Taylor is saying, but not on an individual household level. But so there are still multi-fuel and backup multi-fuel households, definitely.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah. Should we keep going? Is there another any?
I think another question from Jared here.
Okay.
Sorry, just quickly, and David and Taylor, please feel free to interrupt me if I'm getting ahead of myself and you actually do have a graph on this. But one request I would make is, if you don't already have it, I think it would be helpful to see this illustrated with the y-axis being the total heating load rather than just percent of useful heat, because I think what that shows is how the overall heating load is going down as we adopt more efficient technologies. I think that there's often this kind of misconception that happens in the energy and climate conversation in Vermont that we're just, by changing technologies, we're just changing the fuel, but we're also reducing total energy use because of the much greater efficiency of those heat pumps as compared to the furnaces and boilers. And it would be interesting to see how the share of those technologies make up a lower total heating load because of that efficiency of the systems, in addition to the fuel switching. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We do have in 2 slides something that is kind of like that, but not quite. We have totals. Well, actually, maybe it is exactly what you're asking for, which is final energy consumption.
Yeah.
That's in 2 slides. But the other interesting piece, we could also show just the amount of heat that gets provided, which which will also be declining, right, as weatherization increases and everything like that. So
this is combined, but just for Jared, this is showing the reduction in the fuels as a result of the combination of the weatherization along with the heat pumps, and the heat pumps being more efficient. But yes, your point's a good one.
Yeah, great. And so I guess the remaining ingredient in the chart that David just flashed, showing final energy consumption, is what to these building shells. So here we've made also a number of updates. We did receive some updated forecasts from OEO and from VEIC for the sort of forecasted number of home energy retrofits. But we didn't get them for sort of all utilities, so we used some pre-existing forecasts that we had from the earlier analysis. That formed kind of what we affectionately started calling, a baseline or a pre-baseline, because then on top of that, we made another assumption for what impacts the IRA might have, and that's because in consultation with OEO and VEIC, we noted that their heat pump forecasts did not try to account for any additional funding, so we tried to add that back in. Once the IRA funding expires, or in its current incarnation, what we did was then sort of revert and go back to those original forecasts that were provided to us. And then once they end, we then assumed, so following the forecasts, we assumed that the annual number of retrofits per year that was observed in kind of that last forecasted year, I think it was 2033, that would just be held constant through the rest of the sort of scenario time horizon. So like graphically,
back to the pre-IRA, as it were, levels. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So graphically, what this means is this type of a graph here, where the light blue area shows is the cumulative number of residential weatherizations that have been performed. And that's the axis on the left side. And then the blue line through the middle are the annual number of retrofits. So you can see that you can almost resolve, and maybe I should have made them even different colors, but you can kind of visually resolve where that IRA spike is, and also where the current forecast period is for the number of retrofits from the different utilities. And then we've held that number of annual retrofits constant afterwards. And that's where we get.
New baseline has cumulative from 30,000 up to about 70,000 by 2030.
Yeah.
Yep. And for reference, the Pathways report had 120,000 in 2030, and so
As the mitigation scenario.
That's
yes,
right.
as the mitigation,
Not as the baseline, right?
Right.
I forget what the baseline number was, but this is, again, it's a relative. Obviously, from 2,000 a year, we're going up to as many as over 6,000 a year, based on the increase from the IRA, but then again dropping down rather rapidly if there's no additional in the baseline. So assuming nothing more than what's in place now. How are we doing on, where are we on time? It's almost 1. So I would recommend we are on slide 14 we're about halfway through the slides. So let's keep moving, and then we'll leave time at the end. We can take a couple questions on individual segments, but let's keep moving through here if we can. This is that combined. Taylor, do you want to mention a little more? But this is the combined biofuel trillion BTU impacts.
Yeah, this is fuel consumption used for residential space heating only, so excluding all other end uses, and this then accounts for all of the fuel switching and the differential efficiencies of those heating technologies, and it also accounts for the weatherizations, which we sort of simulate as a reduction in the useful heat requirements of different building types. So this is what you get when you add together that end use for all of the different household types across the state. So yeah, maybe in the interest of time, I won't say any more than that, other than it's obviously declining, and sort of as a share of the fuels that is displaced the most, it's definitely sort of heating oil with electricity sort of coming online. But there are a handful of effects here. It's not that all of that red sort of becomes electrified using a much smaller quantity of electricity represented by green. There's a handful of combined effects that are happening here. Okay, the next slide, just to round out sort of residential heating, I wanted to include a slide just on water heating. one of the new assumptions that we've made is to introduce nearly 50%, sort of about 47% of water heating needs in single family households are to be met by heat pumps by the year 2050. And we just sort of gradually and linearly increase the share of water heated by heat pumps until that year. Outside of that building category, we don't touch these technologies. We just assume that that the mix in the future looks like the mix of technologies today. But there is some sort of autonomous energy efficiency that's happening on the fossil fuel side, and so that's why you see sort of this drop in the first decade of final energy requirements for water heating, especially for fossil fuels, just because in addition to moving away from those and towards heat pumps, we're also using those a little bit more efficiently. Okay. I wonder actually, so this slide here kind of harkens back to a change that we made and then unmade during the process. And so I wonder if even though we've had discussions about this slide with PSD and with ANR, for the purposes of this committee, it may actually not be that important to dwell on.
I think, Taylor, that'd be great. In the interest of time, if folks have questions about this, they can reach out to me. I can explain what happened here. But I think we should move on to the other major changes.
Yeah, I think this chart here and the one following it kind of round out buildings with commercial heat pump, with some information about the commercial heat pump forecast that we're making, and these are just a little bit more interesting, I think. So we spent quite a bit of effort, I think, developing our assumptions around residential heat pump penetrations. Then what we did in order to kind of bridge to the commercial sector is we maintained an assumption that we had used in the previous analysis, where we had a sort of a procedure for assuming that 9 out of 10 single-headed heat pumps introduced anywhere in buildings would be in the residential sector, and then the remainder, so 10%, would be introduced in the commercial sector. And then we kind of built upon that assumption, continuing to allow for the fact that in the residential sector, not every heat pump is a single-headed heat pump, but we kind of imagined what the heating load or how many heat pumps there might be if the whole residential sector heating load was provided by a single-headed heat pump, and then we translated that over into a commercial assumption. So here is what we get for the commercial sector. So this is the chart that we've seen earlier for one category of the residential sector, the single-family households. This is all of commercial square feet. Represented as the percentage of the overall commercial square feet that are heated with different technologies. And so here you can see heat pumps moving in and displacing those other fuels. And then the result of that is shown in this slide here. So this is final energy demand for space heating in commercial buildings. And there's a little bit of a decline that is largely because of that, largely because of the introduction of that thin green wedge, which are heat pumps, which just consume energy much more efficiently than the devices they replace. Okay, so maybe we can pause for, I see two questions in the chat, and maybe before we sort of move off of residential and commercial buildings, because we've got a couple slides on transport, we could tackle these. Okay, so most recently, is cooling covered anywhere, since it might motivate heat pump adoption? Yeah, so that's a good question. We don't, so there is a space cooling end use that we represent. We represent the energy consumption for cooling technologies in this model. And as households or businesses, commercial square feet, as they transition towards heat pumps, that also affects the share of technologies that they use for space cooling. In some cases as well, it might also introduce, it might also cool previously uncooled square footage or previously uncooled households if they didn't, if they weren't doing any of that cooling. So it might be kind of an increase in the electricity use for space cooling. So in other words, it is covered. The final energy used for space cooling is just significantly less than space heating. So we haven't prepared any charts on it. But does that answer your question? It doesn't necessarily, whether it motivates heat pump adoption or not, is not really kind of an effect that is simulated here. Our assumptions around the number of heat pumps relate to the percentage of space heating that they provide, and then that affects secondarily the space cooling.
And the emissions reductions with the space heating fuels are more critical in terms of the cooling is electric, but yeah, so it is represented, but the focus is on the displacement of the space heating fuels. Was there another one before?
Well, there was, but I wonder if I've just missed it and it was referring to an earlier chart. Adam, do you want to chime in or ask us to rewind if you'd like to ask your question? Going once.
Yeah, I think it's just related to different data showing wood is more of space heating currently than the chart that was shown. So that in 2022, he's saying that the energy demand is wood accounts for 22% of space heating needs, which is obviously less than what it is shown. Well, actually, maybe that doesn't actually look all that different, because maybe he was just looking at the green. The combination of wood and wood pellets there is probably a quarter or more.
Yeah, I wonder as well. I would want to just make sure we're sort of doing an apples to apples. 22% of space heating needs. Does that mean percentage of households or percentage of heat that is provided? This particular chart shows final energy demand, so it accounts for, we have assumptions for the efficiency with which wood or oil is burned. So I'm not quite sure, but maybe I could invite if there's another source of information that has that 22% in it, we can review that and see.
We can forward those sources along, and maybe we should get to the transport sector.
Sure.
Though.
Yep.
We have like 10 or 12 minutes there.
And I'll just say very briefly, because I don't know if Adam is still on. My understanding is that 22% is a total thermal BTU across residential, commercial, and industrial sector. But that would be good to follow up on. Agreed.
Okay. Okay, so there's a sort of a battery of transport related changes that we've also included here. And I'll just sort of tick those off, I guess. So we have we've included advanced clean cars too for passenger cars. So actually, I'll begin by saying that the model represents all sources of energy consumption, right? In all sectors, all final demand sectors. And for road transport, it represents 4 different classes of cars: passenger cars, light trucks, medium duty vehicles, and heavy duty vehicles. There is not a perfect correspondence of like the Highway Administration's Class 1 through Class 8 vehicles across those 4 technologies that we've represented in the model. And that was, as you'll see in a few moments, the sort of source of a few headaches or assumptions that we had to make. But so there are these 4 different classes represented. So we have incorporated in passenger cars, Advanced Clean Cars 2, which basically shows, or which has 100% of the sales of vehicles being either battery electric or plug-in hybrids by 2035. And then for light trucks in the model, which includes some vehicles which are affected by the Advanced Clean Cars rule, and also some vehicles that are affected by the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. In aggregate, that ends up being, for that category, 90% of sales as electric vehicles by 2035. So that's kind of a weighted average of those two targets, depending upon the different vehicle classes that are represented in that light truck model category. Then we've assumed Advanced Clean Trucks targets for both the medium duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles separately. So reaching 75 and 40% of sales respectively, being battery electric vehicles, no plug-in hybrids in those sectors or in those end uses. 75% of sales by 2035. So showing that graphically, at least for is the job of the next two slides. So the one that David is showing here shows graphically the passenger car sales shares for all the different technologies represented in the model. And you can see that, by 2035, 100% of them are either an electric vehicle, EV A or B or C. And those are just different technologies in the model that have different assumed electric ranges. And then there's a little wedge of plug-in hybrids as well. And then on the passenger truck side, or the light truck side of things, so this chart here, it's not quite 100% by 2035. There's still a few fossil fuel powered light trucks in 2035 and beyond. And then there's also a greater share of plug-in hybrids that we are assuming, I guess, for this category. But when we sort of crunch the numbers, these inputs are tell us what the sales share assumptions is, and then we use the model to tell us, what the total number of vehicles is in any year in the future, depending on sort of the past history of sales. So this chart here shows all light duty vehicles, so passenger cars and light trucks grouped together, and it sort of shows the slower, I guess, emergence or switch towards a vehicle electrification by 2050. So that, even if you are largely no longer selling gasoline or diesel powered vehicles by 2030, it takes them a long time to go away from the fleet. And that's what this chart here is showing. Yeah.
Joey, I think on the light duty side, Joey, you have a question?
Sure.
Yep. Well, one minor comment and then another minor comment, which is if you go back one, this is like really maybe parsing one more. So one more.
Okay.
Sorry. Well, just that on the Advanced Clean Cars too, 100% of sales, I think I would, maybe this is nitpicking too much, but it's delivery, right? And I guess that's important. Maybe it's because as we are thinking about how to fill the gap, we need to recognize that these things may not sell unless there's a public policy or regulatory approach that drives it, that has an accompanying motivator. So whatever, take or leave, but I think it's a little.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is, sorry, that we don't have a lot to report in the transportation space. So I know we keep talking about time. I feel like maybe even 10 minutes for the transportation conversation. So I want to make sure that this is so important that we give us the time we need to work through it. Thank you for the work and presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Joey, for that. And I'm not sure if Megan is still on the line, but my understanding now is that it's model year 2035 is the last model year that any internal combustion engine vehicles can be delivered to the state. So it is a requirement. And so maybe it's just off by a year, that it should be by 2036 for new car sales. Is that,
Model year and calendar year is it's complicated to kind of talk about how they correspond with one another. So I think that's probably right. It's just a difference between the model being articulated in calendar years. And Joey, I just wanted to point out to your first point. I think the question or the point that you made about deliveries versus sales is a really great one, and one that I know we've talked about a lot. And I think that that's a question that will be talked about in the carbon reduction strategy work that's happening right now, and how the contractor that V-Trans is working with to analyze potential additional benefits from what we call like complementary policies to increase EV uptake and adoption, and whether or not those policies and to what extent they would impact the fleet shifting sooner rather than later, and essentially incentivizing people to purchase these vehicles that are being delivered. So I just wanted to highlight that work we'll be diving a little bit more into that question in that other analysis. And I think we actually have a meeting this afternoon to talk more about that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, guys.
I wonder, is there, Joey, or do you think that there is, do we have an if deliveries is 100%, the ratio that would be anticipated to be sales instead in the base, in a baseline without?
Not at this moment, but I would have to lean into the expertise of the A&R team. But so we don't need to spend too much time here, but I just flagging it mentally, and I appreciate the question. And I appreciate what Megan rounded out, because that is happening. And we are having a conversation later today, which is hence why our conversation here may be a little shorter.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, I think, David. And so I think, at least from my perspective, I think I'm okay with how the model currently articulates the sales percentage requirements.
Yeah.
So I think that's the best assumption that we can make, given that it's really hard to predict demand side of things.
So I think we were here. We are approaching. We're towards the end of the presentations. It's 1:15 or so. I think this is the next slide, Taylor.
Sorry.
Okay.
Before you go, Jared, do you have a light duty vehicle question? And then I do want to pause at 1:20 for public comment, because that's when it was listed on the agenda. And then we can come back to finish off the slides and then offer public comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question, it's partially addressed in the chat, but on most of these charts or graphs that you've shown, my assumption is that it's really modeling the share of new vehicle sales, and not trying to account for used vehicle sales, because there's the assumption that basically the used car fleet that were new vehicle sales in prior years are still part of the fleet, and that's why we see that kind of
continuing
I mean, as they take a while to move through the system. So I might just suggest that on the labeling, so that there's not confusion around that, in the instances when it is modeling in each year the new vehicle sales, to say new vehicle sales, because I know that that's been a point of confusion, is people thinking that by 2035 there won't be any. It's just
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Thanks, Jared. Just maybe I'll tell you what, I have a proposal just before, sort of as a lead-in, I guess, to the public comment. Why don't we, and if we're going to return to talking maybe a little bit about transport after, TJ, why don't we actually jump to slide number 26, David, the one after this?
Yeah.
Because I think this is kind of a good synthesis result that shows the overall statewide emissions for all of the different energy sectors, where energy is consumed, but also where energy is produced. So this includes electric sector emissions, and it also includes some of the prior modeling that we had done, or representation of emissions that we had done on the non-energy side, like for waste and agriculture emissions. And there's an assumption in here for the forestry sink as well. So this chart kind of puts everything together, I think, and shows in the dotted, well, I guess what's the important, maybe it's the solid black line that's sort of towards the top there, that shows us the gross state emissions, not including, so not having subtracted forestry. And that dark, or that black line there, it represents the sort of the current state of this baseline. And then the 3 GWSA requirements are represented as 3 different dots here in 2025, 2030, and 2050 respectively. So you can see how it kind of passes through. And then that top line, we haven't done a great deal of comparison between like this baseline and the baseline from 2 years ago. But this chart does kind of show that, at least at a very high level. So you can see the effect of all of the changes that we've made: revised heat pump and weatherization assumptions, increasing the share of vehicle sales, et cetera, and what that does to our baseline emissions forecast here. So I think this is a good place to make sure, I guess, that we show, at least before we get to the public comment.
So we can pause there.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. I think that is really illustrative, like, of the gap, the 2030 gap that we thought we had 2 years ago. This modeling shows that it's about half of it is still there. And that is, like you said, heat pumps, weatherization, that is expected to now happen under a business as usual with and vehicle sales. Before cross-sector members weigh in, I just want to go straight now to public comment. And if any members of the public, we scheduled it for at 1:20. We'll have some time to come back to members' discussion in a minute. Pike, looks like you're up.
Hi, I am about to just posted a link to an in-plan model that shows the economic benefits of Hurricane Michael. And I show this to show how with incorrect inputs, in-plan models can be quite ridiculous. No one would say that a hurricane is at all beneficial, but this economic model, which you can find on the inplan.com website, shows that hurricanes would indeed have an economic benefit. The in-plan model that you use has no health costs associated with wood heating.
Can I stop you just for a
second?
second?
No, you can. It's public comment right now.
Okay.
The Senate Energy Committee and the Bio Task Force both heard testimony that wood heat creates millions of dollars in Vermont in health costs that I don't believe are accounted for. They need to be. I also don't believe that either the pathways analysis and the MAC analysis adequately calculates the actual emissions from advanced wood heat. And I think that modeling needs to change. Thank you.
So I have a reflection on that, but David, do you want to go first?
Just a clarification, this is not reflect, or we have not done in-plan modeling for this this project. So there was an element of the previous CAP analysis that incorporated in-plan modeling, and you may be referring to that or to that analysis, but this analysis is not incorporating in-plan.
There's an in-plan model included in the pathways analysis version 2.0.
Correct. That's not what we're, yeah.
Right. So I think to just follow on, David, I I think that economic impact from natural disasters, that type of thing, that is like a problem with how we calculate economic impact broadly. Like gross domestic product is usually the thing that we measure that on, and that's like a national problem probably, and outside the scope of this group to deal with right now. But I think your point is taken. As David was saying, this is really just the task right now that we're going to, the results are being shared from, are just simply an update to the number of units that we think are going to be installed, and then the resulting emissions impact. And so to your last point, in terms of how biomass is accounted, just to clarify, this is using the same methodology for accounting for emissions, like emissions factors that were used in the previous analyses. And I think the Science and Data Committee is like doing a life cycle analysis and tackling those issues. The Biomass Committee or task group has done some work, and now the process there is being taken up by the full Vermont Climate Council to kind of take the recommendations of that task group and determine what next steps are appropriate. So I just wanted to, I think, you know, I wanted to make sure that, you know, your points were heard here, and then clarify kind of what this group is doing relative to that broader context. And I think that your points are relevant to that broader context for sure. So thank you for your comment. Ashley Adams, you're up next.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call. I wish I could be present for these meetings, and I have to work and I can't be, but I don't know what was said earlier, but I would like to get a comment, and I appreciate it. I'm here to remind subcommittee members that 10 VSA 582 requires Vermont to work with regional states on consistent regional emissions accounting. New York and Massachusetts do not consider biomass to be carbon neutral, and Vermont needs to no longer do so. The EFG pathways and MAC analyses rely on false assumptions that wood is, excuse me, I've got a loud office here, that wood combustion is carbon neutral, and these studies have got to be redone to correctly account for actual science, not convenient, you know, what's a convenient policy approach, but actual science. And it's just really curious to me that Vermont, for all of its claims to be green, is really headed in the wrong direction in terms of accounting for all carbon emissions, not just fossil fuels. It's about greenhouse gas emissions, not about fossil fuels. So, you know, the question for me is, are we going to engage in real climate action or not? And there is a looming legal requirement to do so. So thanks for taking my call. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I do know that the life cycle analysis is being updated, and the the greenhouse gas inventory was just republished. I'm not sure if folks at ANR want to reflect on that, or a lot of this is taken up in the Science and Data Committee of the Climate Council, but I want to not kind of not just I want to appreciate that you're commenting here today, and kind of give a chance for anybody to respond that might want to.
Happy to just narrowly speak to the fact that for the first climate action plan, we did regionally review the way inventories are conducted, and biomass was included as part of that, an inventory comparison. That was 2 years ago now, and at the time we were consistent with the jurisdictions we were reviewing. We do collaborate and discuss inventories and methodologies with neighboring states on an ongoing basis, and that's something that we will take into account, especially as we move to update the next iteration of the climate action plan.
I'd just add very briefly, this is David, and Taylor can confirm, but also LEAP tracks biogenic emissions, so the emissions that are biogenic sourced in alignment with the discussions with the Data and Science Subcommittee and on for the CAP reporting, et cetera. We followed the discussion and the determination and the subtask studies that were done for that. But the biogenic emissions from combustion of biofuels is something that is tracked in the model and can be reported separately.
Great, thank you. So I'm not seeing any other hands raised for public comment. There's another opportunity at the end after we talk about transportation. So Taylor, why don't you go ahead and finish your slides. Actually, Jared, before you do that, I'll give Jared an opportunity to go.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of continue the conversation that we were just having in terms of how emissions are tracked and inventoried. And if you can go back to that the slide that we had up during the public comment, David, I just want to state what my assumption is and make sure that it tracks with what others understand as well, and in particular Colin. So when we talk about emissions from wood and what David was referring to as biogenic emissions, I think sometimes what's being said is that they are assumed to be carbon neutral. My understanding of the IPCC guidance and the way that Vermont does its inventory is not that they are assumed to be carbon neutral, but that we do not account for them within the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use or as energy-related emissions, that the proper way to account for biogenic emissions is within the land use and land use change sector, which I think we can actually, building on David's point, that it is tracked in the LEAP model. It's looking to me, correct me if I'm wrong, David and Taylor, that green line at the bottom is part of where that is showing up. But I totally agree that this is an ongoing, very important conversation in terms of the methodologies of other states, the peer-reviewed science, what is the best way to do this, looking at what not just other states are doing, but IPCC guidance and others. And I just think it's important for us to remember that just because emissions may not show up in a certain category, it does not mean that they are not or should not be tracked in another way.
Thank you, Jared. Yeah, you're correct. There's changes. It is IPCC and EPA guidance are to track the changes in the land use change and forestry sector. In the baseline, the sync of those is declining. This dotted line reflects that in terms of the net emissions, while gross emissions are declining. The net emissions do not decline as much because the LULUCF in the modeling that we did that did not incorporate significant, this is not, our work here is not an update to the changes in the LULUCF. We have not done anything from the CAP analysis based on that, and there was a decline in that. So that's a good point. I mean, when we say it is not accounted for in the RCI energy use emissions based on guidance from those entities. And it is an ongoing and important discussion, and appreciate what TJ was saying about this is being addressed by the council and by the life cycle analysis that's underway.
While we're here, if I can just ask one clarifying question while we're on this graph, and it could be a kind of an optical. I know that when we do these kind of stacked bar charts, sometimes there's almost seeming optical illusions, but it looks to me as though there's almost a projection of a cutting in half of the agriculture related emissions from kind of, where we have been to what is projected going forward. And I'm wondering if that is reflective of methodological updates that are anticipated, or, I mean, I'm not aware of anything that would suggest that I'm not really clear about, maybe I'm reading the graph incorrectly, but it's not clear to me why the agricultural emissions would be going down that significantly in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it's not an illusion. That comes, actually, that's a holdout from the prior analysis, where we, and it does come from sort of some proposed updates in the last analysis. There were a set of recommendations made towards like doing inventory accounting, and as part of that, there was a proposed change, I guess, to accounting for agriculture emissions. And I guess I'm speaking on behalf of some colleagues who we worked with on that project, but I included, or I represented that in the overall model. And what it amounted to was sort of a calibration factor, a recalibration factor that we decided to introduce starting in the scenario time period, but not in the historical time period. Because we also wanted to sort of be able to show convergence with historical greenhouse gas emissions when we looked at. Yeah, that's right. So you're right. The agriculture sector there drops off sharply, and that is from a sort of a methodological recalibration that is baked into that sector.
The carbon budget report, thank you, Taylor. I think the carbon budget report resulted in this adjustment. And if you went back and adjusted historic, which we did not do, so that this is based on past inventory, that drop there would not be, that you would be adjusting these numbers here.
Thanks for that explanation. I'm gonna just, if there's follow-ups, that's was a really good question. Thank you, Jared. And to remind folks, but if there's follow-ups on that, I guess I just asked to reach out because I want to finish up the slides and give Joey a chance to provide an update and then have another round of public comment. So
Okay.
why don't you go ahead. I think those medium duty vehicles, and move apace, please. Thanks.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of the opinion that like we're already having kind of an interesting discussion. I mean, it's true there are 3 other slides in this deck that we haven't shown, but maybe we could kind of gloss over them quickly. We had, before we went to public comment, we had looked at the resulting stock of light duty vehicles. This is the resulting stock of medium and heavy duty vehicles together. These are the results of the model's assumptions for the rate of new sales and the rate of retirements of vehicles. They tend to last longer, and as a result, within this baseline scenario, there is an increasing number of them over time.
So and compared to the lighter duty vehicles, less impact, basically. I mean, less electrification in the baseline.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. This was sort of a lead up to that top-down emissions slide that we just showed, which is to summarize final energy demand for the major end-use sectors here, just so that you can see them all on one chart. Just comparing the overall size of energy demand for residential buildings, commercial buildings, the industrial sector, and transport, to sort of show the relative changes in each one. And this kind of led up to our presentation of sort of summary emissions here. The last slide I prepared is just to sort of remind us, I guess, that within this model, even though the focus of this update has been on buildings and transport and industry, the model includes a representation of electricity production, of energy generation, but also capacity expansion on the grid that is necessary to meet the forecasted electric loads in this model. And so I just wanted to include a slide here to kind of remind us of that all of these assumptions we make on transport electrification and building electrification have an impact on electricity requirements and on capacity requirements and on overall peak load in the system here. And so this chart here if you kind of look at the overall envelope of this curve, it shows, you know, what peak load might do in the baseline scenario, you know, I guess in the absence of any kind of load shifting measures or anything like that. And then I've subtracted away from that the effect of behind the meter solar production, just in the on the left side of the chart. So that's sort of the adjusted load accounting for BTM solar, and then the light green wedge is kind of just it shows a representative assumption for how much you might be able to reduce peak if you took 75%, so 3/4 of the electric vehicle charging that happens during the peak hour of every year that is being forecasted in this model. And you essentially just subtracted it from peak, which is to say you assume that you could shift 75% of EV charging to some other time. It kind of just shows a rough idea of the scale of what you would get and the effect on net peak load, which is the blue bar across the top, or across the bottom, excuse me. So that it's just sort of, it's that together with the overall emissions chart is just sort of a nice summary of some of the baseline results from the other vectors. So with that, I guess I'll conclude my piece. I'm not sure, David, if you have any other kind of concluding comments, but we can also just jump right back into transport questions if you like. See a couple of hands.
Yeah.
Liz, go ahead.
Just making sure I get the punchline of the last slide. The punchline being, if you were able to load control to the extent shown, you would manage to keep the peak relatively flat despite the increased usage of electricity for those vehicles.
Yes.
Yeah, great. That's consistent, as I think we've talked about in the subcommittee before, and I've shared with some of the assumptions we've done as we've started to see electrification. And you know, there is really tremendous customer uptake in those programs when they're offered. So it's good to see that type of assumption reflected here and something to work on as we go forward.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that, so in addition to sort of forecasting peak load, the model will tell us what time period that happens in. So we can also show the the changing coincidence of load, and that's why on the left side of this chart, you see sort of behind the meter solar as a load reducer before it disappears, because over time with increasing electrification, the peak hour moves outside of the window that solar produces, so it no longer is a load reducer.
And flexible load management, yeah, this is just the shifting of electric vehicle load, and so even further coordination on the load management and flexible load is very important. You've made that point before, Liz.
Rich, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I have a question about this slide. Since the revisions to the baseline are showing substantial increases in heat pump penetration, and you've been talking about managing peak load contributions from vehicle charging, which is certainly something I support, and it's important. I guess I'm surprised that the blue bar here is so steady, even considering what one would expect peak load contributions to be on cold days, considering greater heat pumps penetration. So what's offsetting the heat pumps in your model?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the same thing when I saw this initially. I mean, and I think it's because this, despite even the large number, I think, of forecasted heat pumps and heat pump penetration that is included in this baseline, it's still not, at least in this model, moving away from a summer peak. And I'm not showing that in this chart when the peak actually happens. But so even though there is, if I was to show a result of overall just annual electricity demand, it would show a steeper increase. But this chart is like plucking out just the peak load from 1 hour per year. And that's why it sort of hides, I guess, a lot of that extra electricity demand. But I get your intuition for sure. I sort of had the same thought. So we could also show, and maybe this is something we could, include in a final report, just what the bulk electricity requirements are in this scenario.
Jared, go ahead.
One other question that's kind of an underlying assumption question. I believe it was in the table at the beginning of some of the things that were updated were related to demographics, and I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but my recollection is that, for much of the last decade pre-2020, Vermont's population growth was relatively flat, and then in the years since the pandemic, we've seen more of a net inflow. And I'm wondering, and it's always hard to project future population, but I think given a number of variables, it would seem like there's a good case to be made that we'll see increasing population, or at least not at the same level of kind of flatness that we saw pre-pandemic. I'm just wondering what the assumptions are around Vermont's total population that went into this model for future years.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's it's one of the most important assumptions, right? So we have, I think in 2020, for example, we have some what is it, 3. Oh, these are number of households actually. So sorry, I'm looking at the model on my screen, and it will take me longer to dig up the actual population assumption, but the number of households grows by about 8,000 to 348,000 households by 2050. Starting at about 340 is what we have in 2020 approximately. So that just gives you an idea for the scale of the growth in the number of households. And it would be the same percentage growth in the population that we have. We have no separate assumptions for household size changing over time.
Right. Well, thank you, David and Taylor, for this presentation and all the work that has gone into updating it. Folks have other comments or questions, I encourage you to send them in the next day or two while it's fresh in your mind, so that I think we're looking to kind of lock down the business as usual update in the next week or so. So that would I think that's the next step with the business as usual, and then we're going to be analyzing the policy sets, and going back to the broader project of different policy sets to kind of fill that gap, and what it would take and what it would cost.
Yep.
Liz, you have something really quick?
Super quick. You probably said this at the outset, so I apologize. Is the presentation itself going to be linked in the agenda? I don't see it there when I checked a second ago.
I did not say it in advance, and Brian Woods sent me a comment in the middle of the presentation early on, but we will post that presentation and try and send it around to the group. Before we switch over to get an update from Joey, I want to take 1 minute, and I should have done this earlier, just to recognize that we actually have a new member of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee here, and that's Peter Sterling from Renewable Energy Vermont. And I wanted to give Peter a welcome first, and give you a second to say hi.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Peter Sterling, and I'm the Director of Renewable Energy Vermont, and thrilled to be part of the Climate Council. I was nominated by the Senate back in May, so I'm just getting my feet wet in my first couple meetings here, and certainly I'm getting access to a lot of fascinating information and seeing how all the decisions are made. So thank you so much for having me on this committee. I look forward to being a productive part of it.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, Joey, thank you for your patience and for ceding some of your time to that conversation.
Yeah,
So-
no problem. And thanks for taking the time. I mean, happy to discuss anything further. But I think the Transportation Task Group has been a little bit in a lull, in part because, well, first of all, the carbon reduction strategy that is getting underway. And we're really leaning heavily into that. But so just quick update, I think our goal in as the Transportation Task Group, and then ideally in partnership with you all and the broader Climate Council, when ready, is to ground our work in the transportation space in the latest baseline. So this is incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's going to be important for us to dig into that more deeply and, sort of build off that to really inform our next steps. But again, what we're focusing on is building off the carbon reduction strategy that VTrans is leading, and to identify any potential gaps that process and analysis finds, and work from that to make recommendations. I think our hope would be to fill them, and I think our goal as a task group is to set the stage to make a recommendation to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, and then set the table as soon as possible after that for either making a recommendation for a gap filler in the transportation sector to the 2021 adopted plan, or make a more clear recommendation or set of recommendations in the next plan, which is not going to be that far out, but again, make a recommendation to make certain and sectorally proportional emissions reductions in the transportation space in line with the law. And as a reminder, we discussed this issue with the council. We did about a year's worth of work, and the council discussed and made a recommendation aimed at this, related to amending the 2021 cap that recognizes that there are, we essentially looking globally to meet our statutory required transportation emissions reductions. It really is going to require either a cap and invest and cap and reduce approach, or a performance standard, or some potential combination thereof to fill the gaps and meet the letter of the law. And so realistically for Vermont, there are only two really cap and trade options: the Western Climate Initiative, and then potentially, I think, New York's work now to stand up its own cap and invest program. So that work is ramping. I think really what we're looking at are three options: joining the Western Climate Initiative, that cap and invest program, looking to New York and their cap and invest program, or a performance standard, or again, some combination thereof. So how do we get to answering that question? Again, continuing to lean in on the carbon reduction strategy. And at the same time, as a task group, and then ideally in partnership with cross-sector, and maybe there will be windows of opportunity for ongoing sort of edification of ourselves and then others to analyze these two primary pathways. And specifically, we've talked about researching WCI and the New York cap and invest programs, and then doing more research around a low carbon fuel standard or some other type of performance-based standard. It sounds like TJ or Megan, I'll let you share with folks that you've done a little work. Thank you, to begin to deepen that edification process by maybe enabling us to lean into and learn from folks at NYSERDA in New York about the work that they're ramping there. So I think really, again, what we're trying to focus on is based on what we learned from carbon reduction strategy, do more research, more public engagement, more outreach, and then in those two primary approaches, and potentially we maybe need to be ready to invest in more granular policy or economic analyses to inform a more concrete recommendation. So we're really sort of in the phase of trying to figure out where we're at based on the good information that you just provided us, and then sort of figure out where from here. I don't know if Gina or Bram, do you want to round that out at all?
I think Graham had to leave.
But there he is. I see him.
The carbon reduction strategy is incredibly important work, but it's not going to give us a policy design. It's going to be very, very high level. Directionally, we don't see other alternatives to cap and trade or a standard in order to get us to the emissions reductions we need. And so we need to be ready to set up a deeper dive into what these alternatives are going to consist of in terms of policy design and most importantly, economic impact. So there's just a lot of work to do, and we haven't been wanting to sit still when we're waiting for the carbon reduction strategy to work, because we're at a loss, and the consultants have said this, as to what the other alternatives are to get us to the goals, the emissions goals in the act. So that's where we are right now. We're going to be hearing a lot more, and we're excited that the first steps are being taken to do things like talk to New York State about what's going on over there with the cap and trade program.
And I'm happy to have
Oh, you're there.
been able to make it back, and I think Joey and Gina covered kind of all of our thinking about what the next steps and how we get from here to where we want to be. So nothing else to add.
Great. Well, thank you all. I do want to just follow up on what Joey said in terms of an opportunity for the next cross-sector meeting. And Megan, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I think you'll explain the opportunity better than I will.
Sure. So as Joey mentioned, and we've talked about before, New York, DEC, and NYSERDA are partnering to put in place 3 different rules that will implement a cap and invest, an economy-wide cap and invest program in New York State that will complement the existing cap and invest program that they participate with, in, along with Vermont, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for electricity emissions. So transportation fuels will be covered under that program, and we've invited Jonathan Binder, who's the Deputy Commissioner at New York DEC, who is taking a lead role in standing up that program with his colleagues in New York State. So we're hoping that Deputy Commissioner Binder will be able to join us for our July meeting, which is scheduled for July 20th. And it'll either be him and his colleagues, or maybe just him. We haven't really worked out the details yet, but they're right in the thick of their process right now. And Brian just shared a really helpful link in the chat that includes the information that speaks to where New York is in their process, and then also has links to a number of webinars and recordings of previous webinars that are walking through the various elements of what they're doing to stand up their program. So hoping to learn a lot from New York next month. So stay tuned for more details on that.
Great. And I do just want to mention, I think, Andrea, if you're still here, there are some carbon reduction strategy stakeholder engagement events planned for that same week. And I think we're going to try and coordinate so that we're not overlapping.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if, well, go ahead if you want to mention something.
Yeah, it shouldn't overlap. Our public meeting, we're going to hold it on the 19th, just so it doesn't overlap. So we'll have a meeting at noon, a public meeting at noon, and then another one at 6 p.m. And then our stakeholder groups will be that week and the week after, but trying not to conflict with this meeting.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Doing a bunch of public engagement for the electric sector, I know that doing 2 events in one day is not an insignificant thing to move to. So that it's much appreciated by this committee. Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, just asking Megan whether the expectation is that the New York guests would be reporting on their entire proposed program or concentrating mostly on the transportation aspects.
We did ask John to focus specifically on the transportation component of their program. I mean, I think obviously it's economy wide, so I think they're tackling essentially all fossil fuels, whether they're transportation or thermal related, in the same manner. So maybe we could ask him to kind of just speak more broadly about how fossil fuels will essentially be covered under the cap. Or emissions from those fuels will be covered under the cap. So be happy to expand the scope if that's the will of the group. But the initial ask was limited to transportation fuels.
I'll just add on comment, TJ, and for the committee to consider is also obviously part of the buildings and thermal analysis. One of the policies that we're analyzing is a cap and invest for all fuels. And that study will be done to be determined on exact timeline in the coming weeks, but sometime this summer. So maybe it's probably a heavy lift to try to think about the review of the building's thermal analysis at the same time as the invitation to the DC Deputy Commissioner, but maybe August, we could do a deep dive into the building's thermal analysis, which certainly will include also a cap and invest for all fuels. And a Vermont specific analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. As much as it's, it would be useful to hear briefly of how New York is considering, this more comprehensive program. But if they focused on transportation in this first go, that might be more useful to us.
Jared, if you could just hang on 1 second. I did okay in timing for public comment the first time when it was on the agenda, but I did not this second time. I apologize for that. 1 out of 2, maybe better than previous attempts, I think. But so I just want to open to see if anybody else watching from the public wants to chime in with a couple minutes to go. Okay, I hope my delay in asking that didn't cause no comment there, but Jared, did you want to close us out here?
I was just going to say that from my perspective, I think it would be helpful to have the broad context of what New York is planning for their economy-wide cap and invest, and then the degree to which we kind of focus in on details. Agreed that transportation is the top priority, but I do think an overall description of how it's envisioned and intended to work kind of comprehensively would be really important knowledge, because of course, these aren't either or choices, and a lot of the most successful states and jurisdictions that are seeing progress at reducing emissions do not see these as mutually exclusive or either or, and are advancing performance standards at the same time as they're advancing cap and invest. So I think I think personally, we need to keep open the option of economy-wide cap and invest, not just sector-specific cap and invest. So would want to be able to hear about that in the full context, even if we're primarily asking for a deeper dive on how they plan to cover transportation.
Well, I'd be happy to pass that along to John. And like I said earlier, it might really just make sense given the way that they're covering fossil fuel emissions in their program. At least that's what I've seen to date. And I mean, as you know, Jared, I'm always a big fan of economy-wide policy, so I'm happy to pass that along.
Okay, so with that, 1 minute late, we're going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for a pretty productive meeting, I thought. Any few more comments in the next couple of days on the business as usual update, please send those along. And in the meantime, we'll see you next month. Enjoy the summer until then.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.